Hello and welcome to the presentation aspect of my presentation. Hopefully I already said this, but I want to set the framework that people can step out, turn their cameras off, mute at any time, just whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves, as I know this is a heavy and triggering topic. We all have our own relationship with it. I will do my best to say trigger warnings. For the content of this 15-minute video or so. The triggers are mainly suicide practices, with the most triggering probably being the beginning, in why it's important to me, as well as suicide practices today. And topics such as involuntary hospitalizations and briefly mentioning eugenics. With that, I will jump into why it's important to me and a little bit of like my background, my positionality with it. So I have long-term depression and suicidality. It's been about 8 years. I have a very intimate relationship with it. I still experience suicidal ideation most hours of the day. Trigger warning, suicide and suicide attempt without like any description. My uncle committed suicide. I have family members who also experience suicidality and suicidal ideation, which I learned about more recently. And I have attempted suicide multiple times. I often feel isolated and I concealed it and still do sometimes. And my suicidality, just so you know where I'm coming from, it's driven predominantly by living with chronic pain in an ableist society, but also loneliness and isolation. Now I'm going to talk about suicide practices today, and what I mean by that is suicide prevention, and practices around suicidality, so how it's approached, how it's contextualized, treated, and managed. And a lot of times I just refer to this as suicide practices. A lot of times suicide prevention is seen as a natural response and the natural thing to do. However, the way we learn suicide prevention is not natural. It's at the interest of governments, big pharma, training companies who train employees on mental health and standard practices and protocols, like those kind of videos you watch when you start a job, as well as train people, more in-depth trainings, as well as medical experts and major religious organizations. And to break down a couple of those, big pharma literally profit off of these people not dying. So suicidal people, or any people who are on meds or take use any kind of prescription or over-the-counter drugs, big pharma are literally profiting off of the more pills and bottles these people buy, and so has invested interest in these people not dying. And training companies basically are gonna put forward whatever sells, which is heavily influenced by misinformation, and it's also centered around avoiding blame, both avoiding liability for both the company, the training company, and the company that they're providing training for, because that is what companies are going to buy, is training that teaches their employees how to avoid company responsibility or liability. These prevention protocols are a very expert down, standardized and rigid set of protocols. It's largely centered around death prevention, even at the cost of compromising consent or trauma-informed care. An example of this is involuntary hospitalizations and most things about the psych ward, honestly. Sorry, I forgot a trigger warning. It's heavily influenced by colonialism, and is largely about control and surveillance. It can be coercive. In some ways, it can be similar to the criminal justice system in the control and surveillance aspect of treatment of suicidal people. Again, this is seen in psych wards. The current suicide approach to suicide is pathologizing. It's seen that suicidality is irrational or a sickness, which is given under the assumption that people are expected to enjoy life in this capitalistic, colonized society. And the assumption that like all life is to be lived, or that living is the most natural state, which are all kind of cited in the reading. It's also put on the individual to fix it, which is a product of neoliberalism. The whole idea of like, go to therapy, you can heal your trauma. I agree that that therapy is an extremely useful resource, and I've benefited greatly from it, and I highly recommend it to anyone. However, if oppressions still exist, there's still going to be problems, no matter how good your therapy is. Which kind of brings me to another point of, it's not, like, in this very individualistic and reduced approach, there's not, like, a social or cultural context. Things like neoliberalism, colonization, and heteropatriarchy are not studied or considered as factors contributing to suicide. It is recognized that various groups and demographics are like more vulnerable to suicide, like trans folks. However, I don't know, the nuance is often missed in suicide practices today, of that being a vulnerability factor versus the fact that you're trans in a transphobic society. So bringing this to queerness, queer youth, it's very difficult to study queer youth because it's hard to know which youth are queer and which youth aren't queer, even on these like unbiased questionnaires, as well as honesty about suicidality. But most studies agree that queer youth are about 3 times more likely to commit suicide, or any other like things around suicidality. So 3 times more likely to experience suicidality or to have attempted, which many people who study queer youth suicides have a sense of resigned expectation upon hearing about another queer suicide, as kind of a state of the way society is right now. As cited in the reading, a study in the reading shows that patients in psychotherapy hide their suicidality in fear of involuntary hospitalization. And Indigenous and trans folks are 2 of the highest demographics of suicides, trigger warning eugenics, which those populations are heavily impacted by healthcare eugenics, or eugenics via healthcare, or healthcare, as well as disabled folks. And these ideas and necropolitics, if you will, the politics around who deserves to live and who deserves to die, heavily influence mental health care. Yeah, those are my main points on practices today. I'm super excited to dive into the last portion of the presentation, how queerness can inform and improve suicide practices. And by queerness, I mean queering things, queer practices, and pillars of queer theories. I'll start out by saying I mostly research critical suicide studies, which critiques especially the overly individualistic element of suicide practices today. And so at the center of a lot of queering things is decolonization, which kind of, like everything else that I have that would improve suicide practices, kind of ties back to decolonization in some way. We could improve suicide practices by making them by the people, for the people, having them be in queering things and like breaking down hierarchies and having them be a collaboration between the suicidal person and providers. The suicidal person is an expert of their own experience and has their own research and knowledge and experience, which is often undervalued today. In centering the suicidal person and decentering providers, the suicidal person gets autonomy, which is a huge pillar of queer practices. Affirming identities, morals, and cultural values. Culturally competent and social context, which kind of aids in taking away from the overly individualistic aspect, where it's both put on the individual to fix it, like through therapy and support groups and meditation and things like that, which are all great. But understanding that the world we live in is very shitty to many of us, in many ways. Also under decolonization, allowing for more nuance and flexibility within these practices and protocols, and moving away from the rigid, standardized protocols, because suicidality is an extremely nuanced experience among people. Critiquing the medical model. This comes from a disability justice framework. For reference, the medical model sees disabled people, and in this case suicidal people, which fall under that umbrella, as broken or to be fixed or cured, and like broken by their impairment or difference, whereas the social model sees people with impairments or differences as disabled by an inaccessible society. So disabled by inaccessibilities and by society, because we all have differences, and which ones like become disabling is largely a matter of how society functions, I guess, and how accessible it is. So taking that approach to suicidality as well, valuing care, trust, connection, belonging, unconditional empathy, being truly heard, and non-judgmental care. Asking generative questions instead of the assess and treat or fix. Asking questions that the person can explore deeper into themselves and educate the provider more on what's the nuance of what they're experiencing is like. Centering community is an aspect of, these all go hand in hand: decolonization, abolition, and queerness, and queer practices. In my own experience, I can say it's been extremely hard to collaborate with other suicidal people, even within support groups and spaces intended for people that may be experiencing suicidality, because these are often, I guess the ability to collaborate is often interfered with by the provider or a therapist or mental health professional who's there. And like, you're allowed to say, I have also experienced those feelings, but a lot of times a provider will intervene after people express things about suicidality so that people literally can't like go back and forth and be like, oh, this isn't working for me, this isn't working for me, like, oh, and mental health care is not working for me in the ways that I want it to. Given I think this is done out of fear of like suicide or trigger warning, suicide pacts, where people agree to do like complete suicide together and things like that, or the risk of basically danger or harm to oneself in the moment. However, over the long term, it's extremely isolating not being able to build community with other suicidal folks, especially because it's such a hush-hush topic and taboo, and so it doesn't come up in many spaces, and it's really frustrating that even within the spaces where you can build community in general, that it's still not really allowed to build a community around suicidality. Trigger warning, suicide options, without description really. Under autonomy, suicidal people getting to define safety for ourselves, because a lot of times providers will say something is for our safety and we'll use that to justify foregoing our consent. But for me, safety is not death prevention, but rather safer, more accessible, painless, and low-risk suicide options. Trigger warning, suicide attempt, because as I have attempted suicide and have thought about it a lot, it can be very dangerous, and a lot of times they leave people with severe physical and or emotional traumas, and people end up in the hospital with huge medical bills and various things like that, which add more stresses to people's lives. All of these practices discussed in the article in a very queer way it is mentioned that these are just a few possibilities of many. There is no protocol or like, I don't know, queerness, as we've talked about, like resists kind of rigid or hierarchies of like knowledge and things like that. So these are just a few possibilities. And I want to kind of finish on something that the article talked about was the idea of creating a world worth living in.